Welcome everyone. Welcome to the 13th lesson of the Economy of Francesco School. Here is Paolo Santori. I'm speaking from Gubbio in Italy. We are here at the third day of the Economy of Francesco Summer School. And today, as a guest of our Economy of Francesco, we have Professor Robert Frank from Cornell University. He will lecture us about the title of his lesson is The Case for Adding Darwin to Behavioral Economics. And I mean, it's really in line with what we are doing during these days and what we have done since February when we started the Economy of Francesco School. So to try to rethink economics, put at the center also the topics of commons. And I'm very happy about this event, and I asked to Tommaso Reggiani, a friend of the Economy of Francesco, one of the senior member, to introduce Professor Frank and his speech. And Tommaso Reggiani is a lecturer at Cardiff Business School. He's a lecturer in economics. And so I asked him to academically introduce to us and to our guest to YouTube, that I say hello to, Professor Frank. So Tommaso, floor is yours.
Great, thanks a lot, Paolo. Thanks a lot for this invitation. I mean, it's really a privilege for me to be here with you. As Paolo said, I mean, I'm one of the senior members of the Economy of Francesco, but I'm just 38. So, I mean, I'm not so senior in the end. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you Robert Frank. He's one of the brightest minds, I think, of our times. He's emeritus professor at the Cornell University in the US. He got his bachelor in mathematics at the Georgia Tech University. And after that, he decided to serve for 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer in rural Nepal, teaching mathematics. It was back in 1968, and if you have just a rough idea about how was the atmosphere during that year in the US, I'm pretty sure that you can really feel the density and the weight of such a great decision to go abroad in rural Nepal, trying to improve the situation there, really not just with words and just spending some words, but really going there in the field, trying to change the world. That this is in the end what we are also trying to do with the Economy of Francesco. After that, after 2 years of voluntary service in rural Nepal, he went back to the US to complete his studies. He studies statistics and then a PhD in economics from the University of California in Berkeley. After that, he started his academic career at Cornell University. During this period at Cornell University, he successfully climbed the academic ladder, getting to full professorship. And during this period, he also had very different visiting research stays and different activities also in institutions, always trying to bring new ideas to standard economic theories and to mainstream approaches. He is now, I mean, since more than 10 years, economist for the New York Times. Every month, Professor Frank offers us the opportunity really to be exposed to some of the most interesting topics that we can find nowadays at the crossroad between economics and sociology or societal studies. And it's very, very inspiring. So I really recommend you to follow his columns on the New York Times. He's also very active on Twitter. So if you are social in a sense, you can find him on Twitter. His account is Econonaturalist. He's very active, always providing very interesting inputs from his research and from his works, but also posting and retweeting also material from other thinkers that can really provide food for thought also for us. He's the author of one of the most popular handbooks in microeconomics. The first edition was published in 91, if I'm not wrong, and it was immediately, for example, for the Italian public, republished with the Italian translation in 92 immediately. The title is Microeconomics and Behavior. I'm pretty sure that some of the fellows of the economy of Francesco that are economists, I'm pretty sure that some of them, they had the opportunity to study on this wonderful handbook. Of course, this is a kind of main reference for academics, but Professor Robert Frank is also really a very important author in terms of monographies. And in a very long series of monographies, he tried to explore and critically analyze some of the most interesting institutional and behavioral outcomes generated by the interaction between mainstream economic phenomena and the American sociological dynamics. I always found his books and monographies very interesting and inspiring. His main focus is on the US, but I mean, it's very easy to apply the very same considerations also to Europe, to South America, and more or less to all our modern societies. Just to give you some few examples, in '85, he published Choosing the Right Pond, in which he investigated the behavioral quest for status. And this is a milestone also for the first studies in behavioral economics, and also applied to a kind of sociological analysis. Then in '95, he published The Winner-Take-All Society. With this book, Robert started his reflection regarding inequality and meritocracy, analyzing the emerging winner-take-all markets, in which just a small difference in the performance gives rise to enormous difference in the rewards. And more recently, he also, coming back to these kind of questions, he's published really another very interesting book, just based and just focus on a critical analysis about the meritocratic system in our society. In '99, then he published The Luxury Fever, in which he explores conspicuous consumption from an economics perspective. And with this book, he contributed really in a fundamental way to the fruitful establishment of this field of research that is called happiness and economics, or economic studies of well-being, in which with very critical lenses, he tries to analyze the connection between economic variables and the societal outcomes like happiness and well-being. More recently, in a couple of years ago, he published Under the Influence. And with this book, Robert shows us how the social environment actually is strongly influencing our individual decisions. And in a very nice way, I think that he was able to explain why those behavioral externalities that are generated by our peers in different contexts should be targeted and highly regarded by policymakers in order to improve the design of our societies. Today, Robert is going to give us a lecture entitled The Case for Adding Darwin to Behavioral Economics. This reflection is fully in line with some of the thoughts that actually yesterday we received by Stiglitz. So we will continue thinking about the very same path. Robert will explain us how and why, in order to successfully address the most pressing societal issues of our times, behavioral economics should depart from the conventional methodological framework a la Smith, as we were saying yesterday with Stiglitz. So an approach that is mainly based on a quite narrow and individualistic framework focused on just individual incentives, atomistic competition, and self-interest, to embrace, to embed into behavioral economics and in some terms also ecological perspective that is closer to Darwin understanding of evolutionary dynamics. Evolutionary dynamics, in a sense, that is a social dynamic that in our modern society is much more influenced by behavioral externalities generated by the incentives, norms, and institutions, rather than just driven by the incentive per se, that usually this is, in the end, the mainstream idea that we have in economics. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, Robert. Thanks a lot again for your enthusiastic participation to this workshop. And I would say that the floor is yours now. Thanks a lot again.
Tommaso, thank you. I'm waiting for the second version of your talk to die in my ear. I've been hearing you speak directly in sync with your video, but then 30 seconds later, the exact same soundtrack is, and now that's happening in my own ear when I'm talking. So I need to have somebody help me turn off the second voice, or I'll go crazy trying to speak to you.
Okay, so we will try immediately to fix the problem. Also, yesterday we had something similar, so probably the solution is not so complicated. At least we hope so.
Or maybe you have opened the live streaming on YouTube.
Here it's all closed. I mean, all the mics are closed. I don't know if there is a... yes, we have to mute our... Yeah.
That's possible.
So now I think that is that the problem solved, Professor? Do you hear an echo again?
I'm no longer hearing an echo from your end, but I heard an echo of what I said in response.
All the good conference have technical problems, I would say, but yeah, but I mean, from our side, what did you?
Yeah, again, everything I say comes back to me 30 seconds later. So,
Professor, do you have any other window open?
do I have any what?
Any other window open?
Oh, I'm sure. Yes, I have many other windows open. Yes, I have many windows open. So I'm afraid if I shut the Zoom window, that's going to kill our session.
Let's hope not.
Maybe you can close the internet windows.
Do you want me to quit my browser?
Yes.
Okay, that will probably kill our Zoom session. Then I will log on again. I think I discovered the window that was problematic. Can anyone hear me?
I do.
Yes.
I can't see anyone.
We can hear you and we can see.
I cannot see you, so let me. Now I'm back. Okay. I can I can see you again. That was a very exciting experience. I've never had any of that happen to me before, and I can assure you it's profoundly disorienting to hear yourself 30 seconds later saying the same thing you just said. I'm going to try now to share my screen. We experimented with that once and it worked. Maybe it will work again. Let's see. Yes, it seems to work. Can everyone else see my screen? Oh, good.
Perfect.
So we're ready to go. So thank you again, Tommaso and others, for inviting me to participate. It sounds like a very exciting program that you've organized. I've been an enthusiastic student of biology ever since the 11th grade. I had a wonderful teacher in the 11th grade, Casper Wirtz. He taught us that if you understood a few simple principles, suddenly you can see all sorts of new things when you're out in the world observing, and that's influenced my thinking ever since. And I've tried to import some of that way of thinking about things into economics with economic naturalist writing assignment that I do, but none of that is our subject today. The topic I chose for today is why I think behavioral economics would be much, much richer if it included the insights, not just of modern social psychologists and cognitive psychologists, but also the insights of the great evolutionary theorist, Charles Darwin. So the problem that I sense is the focus of your series of sessions is the naive view promulgated by many of Adam Smith's modern disciples who grossly misunderstood his teachings. They have interpreted his invisible hand theory to mean that if we just turn selfish people loose in the marketplace, everything will work out for the best of all possible worlds, and there's a complete coincidence of individual interest and collective interest. Smith, of course, never believed that. The invisible hand idea was an amazingly insightful contribution from him, but what was true about it was that he thought it was amazing that you often got good results when selfish people pursued their own interests in the marketplace, not that you always and everywhere would. The examples abound in which individual interest and collective interest don't coincide. Here's a nice one from Tom Schelling. He asked why an accident in the southbound lanes of a Autobahn cause a traffic tie-up in the northbound lanes? And the answer was quite simple. It's that when a motorist arrives in the northbound lane at the scene of the accident, he's curious, what's going on over there? He asked the question, should I take 10 seconds and look and see what's happening? It's an easy question to answer. Of course, it's worth 10 seconds to satisfy your curiosity. What he does not take into account that those 10 seconds will be added to the travel times of the thousands of motorists behind him. So if those motorists collectively could decide, is it worth 2 or 3 hours of additional delay to see what's happening in the other lanes? No, of course not. And yet the individual incentives point in exactly the opposite direction. So it's not a mysterious idea that individual interest and collective interest aren't the same. That's a very familiar idea. In an earlier book, I wrote about what I call Darwin's Wedge. Darwin's insight was that traits are selected largely because of their impact on reproductive fitness of individuals, not how they affect groups. And that oftentimes traits that benefit individuals work to the advantage of groups also. The keen eyesight of the hawk is an example. But in many cases, the traits that are advantageous for individuals work very much to the disadvantage of larger groups of individuals. And a nice example of that is the bull elk have antlers that are 4 feet across. They weigh more than 40 pounds. Why are they so big? The answer is that elk are, like most vertebrate species, polygynous. That means the males take more than one mate if they can. The if they can qualifier is important because if some males take more than one mate, that means other males don't have any mates at all. And to be without a mate at all is the ultimate loser position in the Darwinian scheme of things. And so these incentives favor males doing everything they can to gain access to females. And in the case of bull elk, as in many other vertebrate species, males fight with one another for access to female. The antlers are their weapons in these battles. If a mutant gene coded for a slightly larger one, the animal that bore that mutation would have more offspring because he would win more fights and have more access to females. And so mutations accreted one upon another, and now these antlers are prodigiously large. That's good when it comes to winning your battles with other males to have larger antlers than they do, but for bulls as a group to have large antlers, that's not so good. These severely limit mobility in densely wooded areas. It makes them much more vulnerable to predation by wolves and other predators. If they could take a vote on the matter, and have all their antlers shrink by half, that would be a very advantageous step for them to take. They, of course, cannot do that, and so they're stuck. There could be a mutation that would produce a bull elk with smaller antlers, but that elk, even though it would be less vulnerable to predation, wouldn't leave any of the genes for those smaller antlers in next generations because he would never secure any mates. The big antlers are smart for one, dumb for all. It's another vivid example of the conflict between individual and group interest. As some of you may know, behavioral economics really was born at Cornell University, my home institution. It built upon the work by the Israeli psychologists Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman. Richard Thaler was my colleague at the time at Cornell. He had a sabbatic year in which he worked with Tversky and Kahneman. Tversky had famously said, he was a cognitive psychologist. He said, my colleagues, they study artificial intelligence. Me, I study natural stupidity. The focus of their work was on the mistakes that people make. They showed vividly that you could put people in situations where not only will they get the wrong answer, even though the problem is very simple, they will get the wrong answer not in a random way, but in a very easily predictable way. Thaler took these insights and was recognized in 2017 with the Nobel Prize on the strength of having essentially founded the nascent, vibrant field of behavioral economics. He and I talked at length in those years. I was very excited with my own observations about how people didn't seem to be behaving according to the predictions of standard economic models. In the early 1980s, I taught what I believe was the very first undergraduate course in behavioral economics. There was no syllabus for the course, obviously, then. I had to create one. I decided to call it Departures from Rational Choice. That was a bad name, I now believe, just because it encouraged a lot of fruitless debates about what it means to be rational. Anyway, that was the name I chose, and I organized my reading assignments under two headings. Departures from Rational Choice with Regret. Those were examples of people making mistakes. We were influenced by sunk costs. Now the economist explains to me why I shouldn't take sunk costs into account. When I make decisions, I should look only to events that can be influenced in the future. When I appreciate the logic of the error I'm making, I'm motivated to stop making that error. I have within my power the capacity to take individual steps that will help me do that. The second heading, though, was Departures from Rational Choice without Regret. And that's an example like the one Tom Schelling gave. Nobody regrets stopping to get a closer look at the accident in the other lanes because it's worth 10 seconds to the person who does it, but it's a bad decision from the point of view of the population as a whole. Standing to get a better view, that's another mundane example of this. So it was my view then, it's my view now still, that departures from rational choice without regret are by far the biggest source of welfare loss in the economy. Departures with regret are important sources of welfare losses. There are nudge units organized in many countries. They have saved enormous amounts of money. It's a very worthwhile research project. Let me emphasize that I am casting no doubt on the value of that program. I'm claiming only that the welfare losses from departures without regret are vastly larger and much more difficult to solve, in part because to solve them, we cannot act unilaterally. We must cooperate with others to devise enforceable agreements that will enable us to solve those, and that's just inherently much more difficult than taking unilateral action. The welfare losses I'm going to focus on today are just a narrow subset of the ones I have in mind, and they're a consequence of spending patterns that are influenced by context. So context is the key concept here. Context shapes every human evaluation. If you're taking your daughter to see her grandparents and she asks, "Are we almost there yet?" Well, there are 10 kilometers left on a 12-kilometer journey. What's your answer? No, we've got a long way to go. We're just getting started. If there are those same 10 kilometers left on a 300-kilometer journey, you'll say, yes, we're just about there. Is it cold out? Well, if it's 16 degrees in Miami in March, in November, you'll say it's freezing cold. You wear every heavy coat you have. If it's 16 degrees in Montreal, you say, what are you, crazy? Is it cold out? Of course, it's not cold out. Look at everybody celebrating the nice warm day. That's completely uncontroversial, and yet economists completely ignore the link between context and evaluation. How much utility do we get from a house? That depends on how big the house has, how many bathrooms it has, how well it's maintained, and so on. Only on its absolute qualities. The context in which the house sits is not taken explicitly into account at all. And yet, if we would make a judgment, is my house okay? No one would for a moment deny that that judgment is shaped by context. I lived in a house something like this one when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal long ago. It had 2 rooms. It had no electricity, no running water. At no time during the 2 years I lived in that house did it seem in any way unsatisfactory. I was always proud to have visitors come to visit me in my house. It was a completely satisfactory house. If I lived in that same house here in the United States, it would not be a satisfactory house. My children would not want their friends to see where we live. They would be ashamed. I would be ashamed. It would be a clear signal shouting that I had failed conspicuously to live up to even the most minimal demands of social existence in this context. If my friends from Nepal would see my house in Ithaca, here's a picture of it, they would think, why would anybody need such a grand house as that? My friends here do not think that. They live in bigger houses than I do, many of them. This is a totally normal house for a senior professor in Ithaca, New York at this time and place. It would not seem that way to people in a poor country. Of course, the people who are vastly richer than professors in universities live in even bigger houses, and we often wag our fingers at them and cast shame upon them. Don't they understand there are people with desperately unmet needs? Why are they spending their money so frivolously on things nobody can honestly be said to need? That's a failure of perspective of the same order as the failure of perspective of my Nepali friends for not understanding that my house in Ithaca is a normal house in my context. These houses, the ones built by the super rich, have been getting bigger year by year for a simple reason. It's that the rich have been capturing most of the economic gains since the late 1960s or early 1970s. What have they been doing? They've been doing what everyone else does when they get more money, they build bigger. The people in the middle aren't mad about that. They even like to see pictures of the big houses. Maybe I'll have one someday when I'm rich, they think. The people just below the top are directly influenced by these houses. Maybe now it's the custom to have the wedding reception of your daughter at home rather than in a hotel or a rented space. So the people who attend these weddings, they think we too need to build bigger. We need a ballroom that can entertain 200 guests. So they build bigger. And then they have guests for dinner just below them on the economic ladder. And those guests leave thinking, well, now it's the custom to have dinner parties for 18, not 12. We need a bigger house too. They build bigger. And we get what I call an expenditure cascade all the way down the income ladder. People build bigger because people like them are building bigger. Why are people like them building bigger than before? Because people at the top are building bigger. That's the story. Without invoking something akin to that story, you just can't explain why people in the middle would be building bigger, because they have no higher real income in hourly terms than they did at the beginning of this era. In the 1970s, the real wage in hourly terms of men was even lower than it is today. We see this cascade across a broad swath of private expenditures. So in 1980, in real dollars, the average wedding celebration cost $12,000. In 2018, it was 3 times as expensive. Why did it get so much more expensive? Because people at the top were spending more, and it cascaded all the way down. Are people happier because they're spending more on their wedding celebrations? There's good evidence that the answer to that question is a clear no. Why are they spending more? Because others are spending more, and to spend less would be to indicate to others that you didn't appreciate what an important day was. We see examples of these cascades in a whole host of domains. Richard Thaler remarked that there was excessive formalism in economics. That's a judgment many of us share. Why is it that there's excessive formalism? Economists don't go home when they receive their journals in the mail eager to read papers like this. These papers are extremely difficult to read. Why are they so difficult? Why is there so much formalism? Well, nobody would deny that if you're in the job market as an economist and you and a rival are competing for one position, it's definitely in your interest to be perceived as the more rigorous of the two. Well, how can you signal that you're more rigorous? You can use more formal mathematical analysis in your paper. This analysis is difficult. Stupid people cannot do it. If you do it, that's a signal to your potential employer that you're smart. The rub is that your rival can respond by increasing the level of formalism in her paper too, and then we've got a higher level of formalism, and then it escalates still further. And so to solve this problem, you can't ask people voluntarily to cut back. I have voluntarily cut back, but it's been at some expense to me to do that, and I've had to compete in a different arena, basically, in order to survive academically by doing that. Here in that spirit is the theory section of my talk. It does not contain any formulas. It makes the point I want to make in the minimally rigorous way that I think the point needs to be made. You can disagree in the comment section if it's your inclination to do that. So it's going to be based on 2 simple thought experiments. You have a choice between 2 worlds. You and your family in world A would live in a neighborhood with 4,000 square foot houses. Everyone else lives in neighborhoods with 6,000 square foot houses. Or you could move to world B. You and your family live in a neighborhood with smaller houses, 3,000 square feet. Others live in neighborhoods with still smaller houses, 2,000 square foot. Which one would you pick? The conventional economic model suggests that this is an easy call. The utility of a house depends on its absolute size. We should pick world A, full stop. In fact, this experiment has been done in many countries, and some people do pick world A, but in almost every place it's been done, most people pick world B. And even the people who pick world A don't say, why would anyone pick world B? They seem to understand why people would pick world B. I would pick world B for reasons I'll explain in a moment, but it's not a mysterious choice. In world B, you're likely to be happier about your house, and there will be other things about your life that will be better than if you picked world A. Here's an exactly parallel thought experiment. It's a choice between relative and absolute advantage, the same as before. In world A, you have a 2 in 100,000 chance of dying on the job each year. Others have a 1 in 100,000 chance. Or you could pick world B, where you'd have a 4 in 100,000 chance of dying on the job. Others have a 6 in 100,000 chance. Which would you pick? I've done this experiment many times, and I have never done it in any context where people picked world B. Everybody in this version of the thought experiment picks world A. So in the first thought experiment, people chose relative advantage over absolute advantage. Here, they choose absolute advantage over relative advantage. There's a pattern here. I'm going to call housing a positional good. That's a good whose evaluation depends relatively heavily on context. I'll call safety a non-positional good. These are terms I borrow from Fred Hirsch in his 1976 book, Social Limits to Growth. A non-positional good, that doesn't mean that context doesn't matter. It just means that it matters less than for a positional good. And the basic theorem that can be easily shown true is that the analogy is exact between the conventional military arms race narrative, in which countries build too many bombs and invest too few resources in schools and hospitals and roads and other consumption goods. I'm going to call them toasters for short. Bombs are to toasters as positional goods are to non-positional goods. Why do we invest too much in bombs? Because relative armaments really matters. If you have fewer bombs than they do, you lose your independence. If they have better toasters than you do, you don't like that, but it's not fatal. If there's a difference in the extent to which context matters for some goods than for others, and that's by definition what we mean when we say positional goods and non-positional goods, then we get exactly the same kind of arms race as we see in the military arms race case. We spend too much on positional goods. Where do we get the money to spend more on positional goods? By spending less, too little in fact, on non-positional goods. That's the whole theory section of the talk. What are non-positional goods? Infrastructure is one. We know that the rich don't get any happier when all their mansions double in size. The rich are happier and healthier and more longer lived if the infrastructure is better. We have vastly underfunded our infrastructure, so we could build heavier mansions and spend more on wedding celebrations. It's a very false choice from the collective perspective. Private interests don't favor investment in medical research and vaccine development, surge capacity in hospitals. The collective perspective favors those investments when the cost of them would simply be smaller mansions for all at the top. The biggest public investment need is to parry the threat from global warming. We've seen 1,000-year floods occur twice in the span of 2 years. Here in the United States, we've seen droughts with increasing frequency, fires. We have a choice. We could tax people more heavily. We could take that money and spend it on non-positional goods that would improve the quality of life of citizens, rich and poor alike, or we could remain on the status quo. Going forward, we could maintain society A, big houses, big expenditures on weddings, bigger cars, shorter vacations, low infrastructure spending, no investment in renewable energy or hospital surge capacity, medical research, and so on. Or we could reverse each and every one of those trends. Which should we do? The literature on the determinants of human well-being is completely clear on that subject. Society B would be better for rich and poor alike. That's been one of the main findings of the vast and contentious literature on the determinants of human well-being. The prescription in policy terms that we would be better off if we shifted our resources in these ways is unchallenged in any of the relevant empirical literature, and yet we haven't made the shift. We have been calling for this shift for decades, and we have not made it. This raises a very awkward question for me. If higher taxes would pay for public investment whose value to the wealthy and others would exceed the loss from the corresponding declines in private consumption, why don't we vote for politicians who would make these investments, tax the rich more heavily and make these investments? I'm going to reaffirm my membership in the behavioral economics profession by saying it's because of a cognitive illusion. And it's not just an ordinary cognitive illusion at that, it's what I call the mother of all cognitive illusions. Let me say a little bit about cognitive illusions generally, and this is consistent with the work of Kahneman and Tversky. They're not things that happen because we're stupid. The world is complicated. We have to process enormous amounts of information on the fly. We don't have much time to think about it. We adopt shortcuts, rules of thumb. Let me ask you here, which of the two squares is darker, A or B? If your brain is functioning normally, it will tell you square A obviously looks darker than square B. Of course, you suspect a trick. It is a trick. It's a trick just like the earlier trick I showed you with the ovals. Square A and square B are exactly the same shade of gray. Here's the explanation. The same amount of light enters our eyes from the two squares and is sent to the brain, but the brain also has one additional piece of information. The information is that the square labeled B is in the shadow of the cylinder. And what we know from experience is that items that are in shadow are actually lighter than they appear. And so our brain, without any conscious awareness on our part, makes an automatic adjustment. It tells us that square B is lighter than square A. Wow, I thought, what a neat explanation. But then I looked at the diagram again and I said, no, it can't be true. Square A cannot be exactly the same shade as square A. And I couldn't reject the hypothesis until I took my graphics program and made a strip to join square A and square B, a strip that shows that there's absolutely no difference between the two shades of gray. They really are the same. But until I saw that, I couldn't believe it. And I take this extra time to show you this just because there will be many times when you're sure something can't be true, but it is true. And so be skeptical, be humble, be open to the possibility that things are not as they obviously seem. So let's apply that to the question of a rich person trying to decide whether higher taxes to fund public investment would be a good thing. The normal strategy we use when we try to decide whether an idea is worth pursuing is to think, how did we feel the last time we did it? So a rich person thinks to himself, how did I feel the last time my taxes went up? That's problematic in the current environment because in the current environment, taxes have not gone up for the wealthy. When I graduated from college in 1966, the top rate in the US was 70%. In World War II, it had been 92%. In 82, Reagan's first term, it was 50%. In 1987, near the end of his term, 38%. A slight increase in 1995, but in 2018, back down to 37%. So if you want to know how higher taxes would affect you, trying to think about the last time taxes went up, that doesn't work for you. What do? You go to plan B. You know that higher taxes reduce your income. So how did I feel the last time I had less money to spend? Unless you lead a really charmed life, there will have been times during your life when you did have less money to spend, even though you're a rich person now. Maybe you had a bad business year. Maybe you had a divorce. Maybe you had a home fire. That will do it. Maybe you had a serious health crisis. Maybe your son was arrested for a serious crime. You had to hire an expensive lawyer. Each of those times you had less money. You can remember how you felt each of those times. You felt terrible each of those times. And if that's what you think is how you're going to feel when your taxes go up. You're not going to want your taxes to go up. You're going to spend a lot of money trying to buy the favor of politicians who will not only not increase your taxes, but will reduce them. And that's the trend we've seen in the Western world ever since the neoliberals started taking power in the late 1970s. So what's the problem with that analysis? The problem is that if you're a rich person, you're not worried about not being able to buy what you need. Nobody has a tax proposal that threatens that ability. What are you worried about? You're worried about your ability to buy the special extras in life, the things that make life seem special. Those things, like an apartment on a penthouse floor with a sweeping view of Central Park, if you live in New York, that's a tremendous thing to have. There aren't enough of them to go around. How do you get them? You have to outbid other people like you who also want them. And your abilities to do that depends on one thing and one thing alone, your relative bidding power. And here's the key point: when your taxes go up and the taxes of other people like you go up too, your bidding power in relative terms is completely unaffected by that. The same penthouse apartments with the same sweeping views of Central Park end up in exactly the same hands as before. If people are worried that a Russian oligarch will outbid them, the fix is simple: put a foreign transaction levy on the purchase of these properties. So that's the basic message. If we took the Darwinian insight into account, that life is graded on the curve, that the ability to achieve important objectives in life depends on relative bidding power rather than absolute bidding power, we would recognize the fruitless bidding wars that many of us are forced to engage in. If you don't bid for a house as expensive as people like you are buying, then your kids go to the inferior schools. Why? Because the good schools are in the more expensive neighborhoods. These are prisoners' dilemmas. They're multi-person prisoners' dilemmas. We can solve them, but we can't solve them acting alone. Let me stop sharing my screen and invite you to intervene with the commentary and questions that many of you must have.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your thought-provoking talk. And now, immediately we jump to the discussion, and I give the floor to Martina Tafuro. She's here on my left, and she's a student at the University of Verona. Yes, Verona, and she's part also of the Economy of Francesco of the Village Agriculture and Justice. So you have to open your mic.
Okay, thank you, and thank you especially to the Professor Frank for this talk, for this lecture. Actually, I want to start with the questions related to our topics during the International Summer School that we are following on together, and about especially on the commons that are also the main topic of this year of school. So you use the term behavioral externalities to describe choices that individual doing and what they affect the social environment. So starting from the point that the individual choice is full of power, that it's important. In your opinion, how is possible to trigger it to a positive change for an happy growth and for, I don't know, the success of a collective action instead only to individual attention? And also, related to it, I want to ask you how can we stimulate the collective action and trust in the government if also the government is made by individuals?
Yes, thank you for both of those questions. They're terrific. In my most recent book, Under the Influence, I describe how my own views evolved on exactly the kinds of questions that you posed. The climate activists have long said it's not about individual behavior, it's about economic policy, that if individuals change their behavior, that would be a good thing, but it's way too small to have a meaningful effect on global warming. We need to adopt massive public investment. We need to have heavy carbon taxes and adopt a range of other policies if we'd have any hope of solving this problem. That was always my position as well, and I still believe that we do need those policy changes in order to succeed. Where I've changed my mind is on whether individual action is relevant for achieving those changes. And what we know is that when somebody buys a hybrid car or an electric car, the effect of that is so small that for all practical purposes, it's as if nothing happened. If nobody else changes her behavior, then the world is essentially the same as before. If everybody changes their behavior, that's good, but then it didn't matter whether you did it, everybody else doing it would be enough. So your individual action was irrelevant. But what we now know is that individual behaviors like that are hugely contagious. The example of solar panel adoption is a vivid case in point. When somebody puts solar panels on his rooftop at time zero, 4 months pass before a copycat installation emerges. We can identify statistically whether it's a second installation that would have happened anyway, but no, it's one that's stimulated by the example shown by the first adoption. So after 8 months, we've got not 2, but 4. Another 4 months pass, we get a doubling again. One new adoption after 2 years' time has resulted in 32 new adoptions. And each one of those adoptions has a ripple effect outside of the neighborhood beyond, this is just in the same neighborhood, because people talk to family and others far away and influence them too. But even more important, taking those steps involves some costs initially. Those kinds of steps change who you are. They make you a different person. They make you much more likely to become the kind of person who would campaign on behalf of a politician who would enact the climate policies that we need to enact. So yes, I think individual action is much more consequential than we imagine it to be within the confines of the narrow economic traditional models.
Thank you, Professor, for your answer, and also if you want to thank.
The same in government. If we want to have a responsive government, that can be changed one individual at a time. We had here a Department of Motor Vehicles chairman appointed who changed completely the way the Department of Motor Vehicles functioned. It used to be the perfect example of bad government. Nobody wanted to go there, but the new director of the department changed it completely, and now departments of motor vehicles around the country have been stimulated by that example to change as well.
Perfect. So thanks again for the answer, and also thanks to Martina for the question. Now I introduce the second UF Young discussant, Tamiris Cristina Resende. She's with us from Brazil. I'm very happy she's here today. She's also from the village. We are part together, Policies and Happiness Village. And so, Cristina, I ask you first to tell us who you are, to introduce yourself, and then to the question for Professor Frank.
So as Paulo said, I'm from Brazil. I am a professor here, a politics and business administration professor, and I work as public policy analyst as well. And I'm wearing blue today to remember all the Afghan women who are suffering with all the things that are happening in Afghanistan. And my questions, Professor, it's regarding the fashion industry and the environment, because each season the fashion industry is launching tendencies and new trends, and some of them crosses the line of we think it's respectful to the environment. For example, we have in Brazil lots of traffic of animals who are being used to produce shoes. They are using skin of snakes to using fashion shoes. And my question is, how can we, as Economia Francesco, can we increase the global awareness about this kind of behavior that it seems in your theory classified as rational choice without regret? Because I don't think that people who buy this kind of expensive shoes regret about this choice. So this is my first question. And my second question, Professor, is regarding the social influence that can be positive, as you wrote in one of your texts. So how can us, Economia Francesco, can work to increase the global awareness about all our issues, our economic issues that we need to think about, that we need to think?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I think an example that really covers both of your questions is the issue of the composition of our diet. The greenhouse gas emissions associated with meat production are vastly bigger than associated with plant-based diets. And so it's in the collective interest to encourage more plant-based eating habits and the consumption of less meat. How might we do that? Well, the traditional economic answer to that question is if there are external costs associated with an activity, the most efficient and just response to that problem is to try to make people aware of that external cost by imposing it directly on them. So the example in this case would be a carbon tax. If meat consumption is associated with additional carbon emissions, then a carbon tax would make meat much more expensive relative to plant-based foods. Now, what we know is that people eat meat because it's the social custom to eat meat. It's their habit to eat meat. They grew up in a family in which meat was the primary source of protein in the diet. And when you have a habit to do something, a change in price has a very small impact on you. So when we raise the price of cigarettes, very few people quit smoking who were smokers. They're addicted to their cigarettes. They keep on smoking. But what's true as well is that there are those at the margin who are less firmly wedded to what they're doing. They do change. So in every group of smokers, when the cigarette taxes went up, in every group of peers, fewer people started smoking because smoking got more expensive. There were at least a couple in each group for whom they were trying to quit anyway. They did quit because smoking got more expensive. That meant in every peer group, there were fewer smokers. That meant in every year after that, fewer people were likely to start smoking. And that meant there would be fewer people still in each peer group. And so over time, since we imposed higher taxes on cigarettes, the smoking rate in the US went from over 50% down now to 13%. Even though the short run effect of a big price increase is very, very small. It's the social amplification of those small changes in the beginning that create the big change we need to have happen. And that's exactly what would happen in the case of the diet. If meat became much more expensive, then we would eat a little less of it. We wouldn't feel so guilty when we served a vegetarian meal to guests. And as that became more common, people would feel less embarrassed by not serving meat at a dinner with guests. So yes, we can make those changes, but it's not as if the traditional remedies are in tension with these other insights. They're complementary.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So back here to Gubbio, I would like first to thank Professor Frank for his talk and the answer to the discussant. I'm also proud because it's 5 o'clock, so we are perfectly in time because usually when I moderate the UF school, it's 5:20 or 5:30. I mean, so these, and then I also want to thank Martina, Tamiris, and Tommaso, because when we imagined at the beginning the Economy of Francesco School, we asked great scholars as Professor Frank and all the others that we've got to come to make a lesson, but for us it's very important also this moment of dialogue, because Economy of Francesco started when the Pope asked also to listen the opinions, the ideas of young economists and entrepreneur. So I mean, for us it's really important. So Professor, really thank you for having been with us. I think that we can show appreciation with our clap here from the audience.
Thank you all very much. It was a great honor to get to be part of the program with you.
And of course, the next year, if you want to come in person here in Gubbio, I mean, positionally speaking, is a good place for a summer school. So I mean, we will be happy to have you here, and the same also for Tommaso and Cristina. So the remaining task before I mean concluding this meeting is to remind all the people following on YouTube that we have one lesson left of the Economy of Francesco School. Next September, the 15th of September, we will have Cristina Bicchieri. And so for this year, with the 14th lesson, we conclude our works. And so I'll see you all at the next lesson. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Robert. Thanks a lot for the talk, for joining us.
Yeah, good to see you again, Tommaso. And